Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's broadcast. We have Professor Bolaji Akinyemi in the house again. And today we're going to be talking about police reform, we're going to talk about activism, and a whole host of other questions that you have submitted. It promises to be an exciting time, and I'm sure that the professor has some opening words to share with you.
Well, hello, good evening, or good day, depending on where you are. I'm looking forward to our interaction. Hello.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, sir. So we'll pick up straight away from where we stopped last week. And before we even go to that, I want to thank you all who have contributed your questions and continue to do so. So, one of the things is how do you contribute to the questions for this event? Well, you can go to slido.com and the event number is 52139. It's showing up on your screen right now. You can also submit your questions on YouTube. You can submit your questions on Facebook. And today we're doing something very different. You can submit your questions on Instagram. So all these channels are open, and please do join. Send in your questions. Let's put the prof under some pressure. Now we go on to the very first question from last week. This was from someone in Jos in Nigeria. And the question is this: a lot of African countries have benefited and continue to benefit from foreign direct investment. And their question is that a lot of these African leaders are silent regarding the issues in the US. And is it likely that they fear any diplomatic backlash?
Um, that's a good question because I've been surprised myself by the silence from African leaders. Uh, I'm aware, by the way, that there have been um, protests, demonstrations on a few of the capitals of the African countries. Not enough to write home about. I don't really have an answer to that question. Why the silence? Um, is this uh, a fear of antagonizing the United States? Um, are they being are they frightened? I don't really know. I don't have an answer to that question. But I have been amazed and shocked myself. Now, is it possible that it is one of the consequences of the COVID-19 lockdown? Because in most of the African countries, we still have the lockdown in one form or the other. So are people just frightened about the COVID-19 and are their governments preoccupied with that they really can't shift their attention to the Floyd issue in the United States. However, for those who watched the funeral yesterday, there was a message from Ghana, from the president of Ghana. And I, as an African, was proud to embrace that, even though I'm not a Ghanaian. But you know what? It reminded me of the days of the activism of Kwame Nkrumah when he did African proud. So maybe the circle has come around, and we are having another Kwame Nkrumah Ghana acting on behalf of Africa.
Wow. Wow. All right. So let's start with the questions for this week. Police reform. There's been a lot in the press lately regarding police reform. Many people are calling for this. But at the same time, the challenge is, what does good look like? Can you help us out here, sir?
What does what?
Good look like from a police force? What do we want to see in our police force for us to give them the thumbs up for the work that they're doing?
Now we're talking about police reform in the United States and in Europe, all over the world.
I think it depends. We can, definitely in the US, we want to hear your views on that. But also, we want to hear your views on Africa, because in Africa, it's not so much the black killing white or white killing black. It's black on black in police brutality that we're seeing in Africa. A slightly different dynamic. But let's start from the US and Europe, and then we come home to Africa.
I think the kind of reform that we should be looking forward to in the United States are the following. One, the mode of restraint that the police will be allowed to use. I have been quite surprised myself that as soon as they start to pull an African American, the next thing you see is a hand to the neck. That's even while the man is still standing, not to now talk about the knee to the neck after they've got the man on the ground. So I think the first thing we would like to see is an abolition of that must not be a tactic of restraint. Nothing about the neck. That's the first one. The second one is this racial profiling. That the moment the police see a black man, they go into an antagonistic mode. And really the way to then sort that out is, I don't know if you noticed, there was not one single black policeman when Floyd issue was taking place. When he was being murdered, there was not one single black policeman. So I will say that the patrol team that goes out must be multiracial, so that any white policeman who is about to show prejudice will become conscious that there are black policemen with him who will notice what he's doing. And also the African Americans seeing black policemen will become less frightened that anything wrong is going to happen to them. Number three should be this question of who bears liability when the police get sued. My understanding is right now is the taxpayer who pays whatever. If you sue the police department or you sue individual policemen, it is the taxpayer who pays. I think that liability should become individual. If a policeman gets sued for misbehavior or for behavior that is less than what is expected, and if the court finds against him in a civil suit, he is the one who should look for the damages and the liabilities, to be paid. Number four, I would like to see, local police forces get a lot of their weapons from the federal government in the United States. And these weapons are lethal. These are things that were bought for the military, and when the military moves on to another grade, of weapons. They pass them on free of charge to the local policemen. They also fund part of their budget. I would like to see the federal government using this to control and moderate the behavior of the police force. So that those are the things I would like to see in the United States. I'm afraid I'm not in favor of disbanding the police force, because just as you have the police, you also have crooks. And we're not talking about Afro-American crooks. We are talking about white criminals equally. And you need a force that is going to protect the society from the bad elements, even among the civilians. But it's a form of reforming the police, form of control of measures, controlling measures that can be put in place. So those are the things I would like to see in as far as the United States police force is concerned. But then this is not going to be different from Europe as well. A lot of the things I've heard of Europe have also involved white policemen misbehaving, shooting blacks, killing them, rough handling them, and what have you. Now, if you increase the percentage of blacks in the police force, and make it more representative of the society, then this could serve as a more moderating influence on the police. I understand that even in Britain, in the judiciary, there is less than 1% of the blacks who are represented in the judiciary. Surely this must be unacceptable. In the United States, we do have a lot of Afro-Americans, Latinas and so on, who are now in the judiciary. But in Europe, the judiciary is still mostly white. And there's something that must be done about that. That's the extra reform that we must have in Europe.
Now, sir, we have some people talking about defunding the police. Now, you've said you don't support disbanding, and frankly, we think that that's unrealistic. You are always going to have people who are, like you say, people who are going to be criminals, and we need the law to deal with them. But then there's the other side, which is defunding, reducing the investment in police forces to deal with the real core of the problem, which is, why do we have criminals in the first place? What is your view on defunding?
Well, obviously, I have listened to the pros and cons on defunding. Let's get one thing clear. I'm not involved in the debate in the United States itself. Sufficient funds must be made available for the police to be able to perform its functions effectively. But obviously, there is this view that too much money is being pumped into the police, and that the police is being made to deal with social and cultural issues in the neighborhoods. And that if only part of that money would be devoted to dealing with these social and economic issues, it will mean less police intervention in the neighborhoods, and that will also mean that police will need less resources. So really, my own definition of defunding of the police would be that all the padding of the police budgets will now be transferred to social and economic reforms in the various neighborhoods that you have. So you won't have to use the police to deal with issues like, husband and wife, having quarrels, or somebody's, leading his dog onto the park, and instead of the dog being properly being on a leash, it is left to roam around. These are the kind of things which perhaps you could have another kind of force, but not police force, that could deal with this, and the funding will come, of course, from the local council. But instead of all that money being dumped on the police, you will use it for reform agents in the neighborhoods.
Got you. Oh, all right. Now, before we leave the police reform question and move on to a question here that's on activism, you've talked about United States, you've talked about Europe. How about policing in Africa?
Yes. And some of the things we have spoken about in the United States, in Europe, will also apply to Africa. I have served on an electoral reform committee that raised the issue of how we use police in Nigeria. And you won't believe it, the United Nations itself says we need about 1.5 million policemen in Nigeria, given our population and the size of the country. We have only about 350 policemen. 350,000, I'm sorry, 350,000 policemen. The UN says we need 1.5 million. So we are not even talking now about, defunding of the Nigerian police. We need more policemen, better training, and more resource allocation for our policemen. We also need, of course, to reform their behavior. The police, in dealing with the civilians, must accept that they are paid and they are maintained by the taxpayers' money. We are talking generally now, because really Nigerians don't pay taxes. So you can't talk about, any institution being maintained by any taxpayer. However, the money is still coming from the national budget. And maybe that money could have been used for education or for hospital that is being used to maintain the police. So, three things. One, we need more policemen, we need more training, and also we do need to reform the behavior of the policeman, the policemen in dealing with civilians. All over Africa, I often see it on television, they're beating, tear gas, and at times shooting to control the crowd. You don't need to go that far. You don't. We must find, just like we are talking about reforming of police in the United States, of reforming police also in Africa.
Yeah, but Prof, could it also be that the reason we don't have enough of people in the police force in a country like Nigeria is because the perception of being a policeman is not necessarily a good one, right? Sometimes you see the U.S. Marines, the way they're dressed, the way they carry themselves, and then you look at the average, let's say, Nigerian, and not properly dressed, looking shabby. There's nothing that looks interesting about them, other than, you know, the hard face, the gun, maybe they've even been on drugs. Is there anything that could be done to change that perception of policing in Nigeria specifically?
Well, let's put it this way. There is absolutely no reason for the policemen not to be properly kitted, if not for irresponsible behavior on the part of their superior officers. Because even for the 350,000 policemen we have now, money is voted in the budget for uniform. Where does that money go? Obviously, it doesn't go to providing uniform for these people. That's number one. Number two is the training that you need to go through. I'm not persuaded that beyond training of our policemen to march properly, and they do march properly at ceremonies, I'm not sure they are training how to handle civilians in a civilian police confrontation beyond aggression from the police to the civilians. All this need to be looked into. Finally, in addressing the issue you raised, given the fact that there is so much unemployment, even among graduates, believe me, if you decide today that you want to recruit 500,000 graduates into the police force, you will get them. I mean, I was teaching in the universities in the 1970s, and even by that time, some of our graduates were already going into the police force as cadet assistant superintendent of police. Graduates. So you can imagine now, if you decide to really open it up, you will get sufficient graduates that will be prepared to go in.
Wow. Wow. All right. Let's move on to activism. There's a question here that says activism is not new, but how effective is this in delivering real change in a nation, in the US, in Europe, in Africa? We've seen activism. I mean, we all know of the 1963 speech of Martin Luther King, "I have a dream." But some of the issues we're talking about today were issues that were there then. Even if you go back to as far back as 1916, 17, 18, the issues that were there then are still the issues we're dealing with today. So how effective is activism?
Activism is effective. Take it from me. Rome wasn't built in a day. At the time, and I was in the United States when Martin Luther King and fellow activists were having their civil rights marches. And don't forget that it was this activism that led to various legislation guaranteeing the right to vote, guaranteeing the right to housing benefits. Obviously, Martin Luther King could not have won all the battles. I concede that. Number two, society is such that when you push, you get a pushback from those who don't agree with you. And it then becomes a balance of forces. And people will say, right, we've had enough. Or, no, not that we've had enough. We've won a few battles. We will continue to fight the war for the other things that we will need. In the 60s, how many Afro-Americans were in Congress? How many Afro-Americans were on the judiciary? In fact, I think the first black justice of the Supreme Court in the United States was appointed by Lyndon Johnson after JFK was assassinated. Now, with the activism that has arisen from the Floyd's murder, you are going, I mean, after all, statues are being pulled down, not only in the United States, but in Britain as well. And I understand that in Belgium, they've removed the statue of King Leopold, who performed all those atrocities in the Congo. The statue had come down just within 2 weeks of the Floyd activism. Some of the statues of slave owners in Britain had been brought down, arising out of 2 weeks of activism. But the debate had been going on all this time, but there had been constant pushbacks, push forward, push back. So in a way, we need to accept that activism must never end. It will not achieve all the objectives within 1 day or within 2 weeks. There will always be pushbacks, and then there will always be push forward. If I've asked myself, now that Floyd had been buried and several of the police forces in the United States have talked about reforms and what they are going to do, are we going to see a come down in the Floyd activism? And when will actually the demonstrations stop? Because I'm a political scientist. I know this cannot go on for months. Sooner or later, people will go home. And then, until something else happens and brings them back. However, when they go home, we must ensure that debates and decisions don't stop in Parliament, in the local councils. The councillors now have been energized. That's something which I just said. In terms of recruitment into the police force all over the world, there must be, maybe you will have to set a target. There must be recruitment into the boardroom. But we start with 1/4 of management and boardroom being multiracial in the next 2 years. I mean, after all, there was a time when there was a struggle to increase the percentage of women participation in the boardroom, and they started setting targets for years. Maybe we'll have to, that this will now be what we will be pushing for in Parliament, in Congress, that in the boardroom and in management level, whether within the police or within the judiciary, within the next 2 years, there must be 25% representation, and in the next 5 years, there will be 30% representation. So we have to set targets, and we have to continue to push, but activism does work.
Okay, but when you look at the level of activism we're getting nowadays, it seems increasingly more difficult to avoid it going violent. How do you get activism to be done in a peaceful way?
There are many reasons for violence. I don't rule. You remember what I said, that you push forward, you get a pushback
Yeah.
by antagonistic elements. How are you sure that some of this violence that we have seen have in fact not been engineered by what we call agents of the deep state? Has the violence been by some members of the KKK in the United States? Has it been by Trump supporters just to discredit activism? Do we know?
Wow.
Don't forget that during the days of Thatcher, Margaret Thatcher, when she had that confrontation with coal miners, it later on turned out that some of the violence that attended that coal mining demonstration actually were orchestrated by members of the security forces, even in Britain.
Wow.
This was not known at that time. It was much later that one then knew that security forces in Britain, in Mufti, were involved in some of the violent demonstrations just to discredit the coal miners. So we will always have this. It's part of the pushback by the system to discredit agents of change. We will always have it. But I noticed that by the time it became clear to the activists that that they had been penetrated, the activists themselves started policing themselves. I have seen where, in fact, they jumped on some of the people who are doing the looting, that this is not why we are here. So, in a way, you have to expect it. You have to.
Yeah. So you are not new to activism in your past years. You were very active in that space. Did you fear for your life?
Beg your pardon?
I said you are not new to activism. You were also involved in the past. Did you fear for your life?
No, because again, times change. You may be talking about Nadeco days. And one of the things that those of us who were, should we say, who have been members of the establishment, but who were now being activists, one of the things we made sure we did was to make sure that from amongst us, there was no violence. There were people who were ready to confront the police near the High Commission in London, and I had to interpose myself between them and the police and tell our people the police are there to protect us, as well as to make sure that we don't get involved into violent confrontation with elements who had come to defend the High Commission. One had to do that. So, but I never feared for my life. It never got to the kind of activism and demonstration that we are seeing now. It never did.
Wow. Wow. We have another very interesting question here as we move from activism and we start to look more at the black race. Having been a diplomat yourself and as a professional at that, I'm sure you would have had to deal with something like this, which says, how can the black race gain real relevance in the foreign land? Because even within the black race, we don't see ourselves as equals. And there's a citing of the xenophobic issues in South Africa and in other parts of the world. that what can we do to be relevant in a foreign land?
It has to start from home. It has to start from home. I'm old enough now to remember days or years past when the whole world looked down on the Japanese, including Africans. Parker pen, you made a distinction between the one produced in Japan and the one produced in England. You made a distinction between shoes produced in Japan and shoes produced in the Western countries. All these were part of looking down on the Japanese. Who looks down on the Japanese now? Nobody. They didn't get recognition by begging.
Wow.
They didn't get recognition by preaching. They made sure they developed Japan to the level that Japan could not be ignored.
Wow.
The same thing has happened to China. I was a student in the United States in the 60s when the kind of language used against the Chinese by American diplomats was appalling. Appalling. I mean, it was like, what can they do? But the Chinese now decided that they were not going to concentrate on economic development. They were going to build up their military base, that they were going to become a nuclear power. The day the Chinese exploded their first nuclear tests, the language used in the United States changed to one of respect. It changed to one of respect. So the point I'm trying to make is the Chinese or the Japanese or people who are looked down upon will not get recognition by begging, by demonstrating. You are going to get recognition by building up your home base, either industrially, as the Japanese did, or militarily, as the Chinese did. After the Chinese had got that military base, it was then they now turned around to start developing their economy and pulling millions of their people from poverty into the middle class. So for us, blacks, we will have to develop from home. We will have to pour our resources into either developing industrially or developing militarily, and then turn around and develop industrially. That's what we're going to have to do. We've begged enough.
Prof, is that what you were trying to do when you were talking about the concept of medium powers?
Precisely. Precisely. I was challenging Nigeria to see itself as a major global actor and how to sustain that position. But I didn't want to talk about Nigeria, but believe me, we're funny people. We took more pride in being the country with the largest importation of French champagne. Yes, we took pride in that. We took pride in being a country with the largest importation of vehicles, of pleasure cars, of Rolls Royce. A country where you have no good roads. You are importing. You want to be the largest importer of Rolls Royce. We in Nigeria have taken pride in being a consumer country rather than a production country. But fortunately for us, we have the resources. We are not a banana republic.
Wow.
We have the resources. And that resources had allowed us, from the time of Murtala, to pursue an activist foreign policy. But to sustain that, we needed to be a global actor and build a construct around being a global actor that would then make us turn around and build up our domestic base. Remember, I also said that actually we should produce a black bomb. Nigerians were my most vehement critics on that issue, not even foreigners. I later on discovered that the United States, Europe were rather rattled about the prospect of Nigeria embracing nuclear development. But my own people, didn't want to hear about that. They would rather spend the money on importing Jaguar, importing Rolls Royce, importing Japanese cars, and importing, listen to this, Chinese toothpicks.
Wow. Wow.
Chinese toothpicks. We produce the wood here in Nigeria. They cut down the wood illegally, ship them abroad through our port, and then return them as toothpicks.
Wow.
Can you imagine?
Wow. Prof, what I hear you saying here is this. For us to be relevant in a foreign land, we need to be economically empowered. We need to be intellectually empowered. And we need to bond together as one. Because some of the ideas you're talking about here, if those ideas had been picked up, had been built up, now Nigeria would have been a major force to reckon with, rather than a nation that's just trying to build itself out and we're constantly evolving and trying to come out of this thing.
You are quite right. The only place where I would disagree with you is talking about building up ourselves intellectually. We have always been intellectual giants.
Wow.
The first lawyer, the first Nigerian lawyer who went to law school in Britain, graduated in 1842. The first, 1842. And go through the records of Oxford, Cambridge, London School of Economics, Bristol. You've always had Nigerian graduates, and you still, till today, have Nigerian students performing creditably in universities all over the world. And when they graduate, they perform excellently as professionals wherever they are. The statistics show that Nigerian medical doctors are among the best performers in the United States. So in terms of intellectual development, we have nothing to be sorry about.
Wow.
And nothing to worry about. In fact, what we need to do is to provide more opportunities at home in terms of development of our universities for graduates, Nigerian graduates, to bloom, to blossom. And after they've graduated, to now provide opportunities for them industrially, so that they can use their talent wherever those talents are needed in matters of national development. But in terms of economic development, in terms of technological development, we have a long way to go. Whether in Nigeria or in Africa, Rwanda seems to be performing miracles. But that is a question for another day, maybe. Why is it that you need to make up your mind? Do you want to practice democracy or you want to practice development? Most of the African countries like Rwanda, which are not democratic but are developing technologically, is because they don't waste their time on elections being held, campaign being held, pouring money into INEC and all this, which at the end of the day leads you to nowhere, in fact. But I won't go into that, maybe another day. One of one of our people may be interested in having this discussion on development or democracy. Which one is going to come first?
Wow. Development. You've given me a topic for us to pursue there. Development or democracy. So there is a choice to be made.
Oh yes, there is. Why is China galloping in terms of even overtaking the United States? When you're talking about 1 billion, or can't remember the population of China now, you cannot put those people into a developed middle class existence by wasting your time debating on human rights and when is the next election. A time for that will come. But what should you concentrate upon now? In Nigeria, we are spending all our time debating, free elections, which are never free. Political parties, how many political parties are we going to have? Can you imagine a country like Nigeria, 45, is it 45 or 50, if not more, political parties? We're just kidding ourselves. Doing what? Well, what are you doing if 45 or 50 political parties? People, you and your wife will just form one political party and you'll be drawing attention to yourself. So,
dear God. Wow. Okay. Let's move on because I'm just looking at the time, and Prof, every time we talk to you, it's so insightful. We're running out of time and I'm thinking, oh dear. But there are a few more questions that I think we can pick today, and then next week we'll continue with some of these questions. So there's an interesting one here, Prof. There's this notion that we need more black faces in the boardroom. We need a more multicultural executive in organizations. But a big question in the minds of people is this. Let's stay with the black race here actually. Does a black man being in power actually mean development for that race?
Good question. You've raised a good issue. And surprisingly, the answer is very simple, really. One man cannot make a difference. That's why when I was talking about representation, management level, or in the boardroom, I was talking about percentages. Now, you had one Obama, and he appointed, his attorney general was black. He had several cabinet members who were multiracial, let's put it that way. But the system itself was still there. And it's like dropping a man into the sea without the accompanying instruments for survival, he will spend most of the time trying to make sure he doesn't drown. But if the accompanying elements, not only for survival, but for performance, are there, then it will make a difference. And that's why I think that rather than, I was surprised, I didn't even know this. Several police chiefs in the United States are African Americans. But what can one police chief do when the police force itself is endemically racist? What can he do? He was facing the police union, which was, determined to make sure that those police chiefs fail by standing up to him anytime a police chief wants to do reform.
Wow.
So, but if you are going to have not only one police chief, but several police officers, a multiracial police officer, that even the police trade union itself will have to become multiracial, then you are going to get changes. So that's why I talked about percentage representation at management and at board level. Now, let me address an issue which somebody may raise later on. Is this now going to lead to lowering of standards? Because I've had that so many times. You know what I used to tell the apartheid regime in South Africa? Why do you need, if you believe that Africans are inferior, why do you need to put all these laws there to prevent him from performing? You don't need those laws if you really believe he's inferior. Remove those laws. Since he's inferior, he won't be able to perform. It's because you believe that without those apartheid laws, the black man will show his talent and perform brilliantly, that you put those laws there.
Wow.
So I'm not asking for merit to be sacrificed when I talk about percentages. In fact, the reason you don't have blacks on the board level, apart from tokenism, or you don't have blacks at the management level, apart from tokenism, is because they are discriminated against. Remove those elements of discrimination, they will perform brilliantly. And you may then need to push to remove those discrimination, those discriminatory practices. That's why I talked about percentages. So a tree cannot make a forest, but several trees do make a forest.
Wow. So in the US, and I think you've answered this, but there's a question here that says the first black, I think it's Chief of Naval Staff. Is this a welcome change to say that we have a black Chief of Naval Staff in the US now?
Chief of Air Staff.
Air Staff, yeah.
Yes, but the important issue is that he will be the first black service chief in the history of the United States.
Wow.
Let me remind our audience that he was nominated in March, before the Floyd thing happened. So he wasn't nominated to appease the demonstrators on the street. He'd been nominated as far back as March, but it's just that what do you call it? The Senate has just approved that nomination now. Welcome it, because if you don't welcome it, you don't even recognize that this man got it on merit.
Wow.
each time we get disappointments and they are done on merit, because if you look at the background of the man, you will know that this is not tokenism, this he got on merit. The United States should be ashamed of itself that you are getting the first service chief after how many years? 500 years? You'll be ashamed of them. And he's the only four-star general, by the way. The only four-star general that is black. There are several three-star generals. There are several two-star black generals. But he is the only four-star general who is black. The US should be ashamed of itself. And he was appointed, by the way, a four-star general by Barack Obama in 2016, I believe.
Wow.
Or was it 2016? He was appointed by Obama. So there must be more appointments of black officers who are damn capable to the four-star level. And then, then we don't need to even be singing and dancing that one has just become service chief. This is something that should have been done if Kennedy had not been assassinated. I'm a fan of Kennedy, a very, very great fan of Kennedy. If he had not been assassinated, believe me, the black achievement and progress in the US will have moved 20 years.
Oh, wow. Prof, this has been explosive. As usual, again, we've run out of time. So, to our viewers, please, next week, join us in this conversation. Invite your friends. The Prof is going to be here again. We're going to continue this conversation. As you have seen, this is insightful information. It's something you can use practically. I was just listening, some of the steps he was outlining, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'm thinking, wow. These are things that we can use. Thank you for joining. Prof, thank you once again for being here. We'll see you all next week. And that's it for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.